Hey everybody, if you're tuning in right now, you are on time and all your friends are not. So we're going to give them a couple of minutes to tune in. My name is Andrew Ackerman. I'm the Managing Director of Dreamit Urban Tech. And we're going to talk about why traction is such a squishy term. And we're good. Okay, thank you everyone who came in to join us. My name is Andrew Ackerman. I am the Managing Director of Dreamit Urban Tech. And next to me you have Sarah. Sarah, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, Sarah Malewski. I'm the platform director here at Dreamit, but also run the Urban Tech program along with Andrew.
Cool. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to talk a little bit, just for about 5 or 6 minutes, I hope, about what it is that investors mean when they talk about traction and why that's such an infuriatingly squishy term. Hopefully by the time I'm done, that'll be food for a lot of questions from you guys about specifically what we mean about traction and in the startup space, but then also anything you want to ask about your startup, about the startup world, or about Dreamit. It's really kind of an open forum. When you have a question, just type it right in. Sarah's going to field those questions and she'll bring to my attention.
And a reminder, when you do post questions, let us know where you're from.
Yeah.
Where in the world? Name,
city, startup name if that's not immediately obvious. And just enough about the question so that we know how to answer it. But let's get started without any further ado. So there are 5 main it depends type issues when it comes to traction. I'm going to deal with each of them in turn. So the first one is the slope of the line. So if you visualize a graph that shows, say, your revenue over time, we want something that looks steeply up and to the right. And the way I kind of present it to you is, if you have $1 million in annual recurring revenue, what's more impressive, getting there in 6 months or 6 years? And that's not a trick question. Obvious, that answer is immediately obvious. So the slope of that line is one of the first things I look for in assessing traction. The second thing that I look for is what did it take for you to get there? So again, same hypothetical startup, they've got $1 million in annual recurring revenue. Did they spend $500,000 to build the platform and market it? Or did they spend $2 million? Now, here's where it gets a little bit squishier, right? We sometimes have companies that come to us. They had a version 1.0 of what they built. They find out, well, that's not what the market wanted. So they, when you use the P word, they pivot, and then they bring out another version of the product. So what happens if that company that raised $2 million basically burnt 1.5? And then they're like, that didn't work. We're going to take the part of it that kind of seemed like it worked, and we're spend another $500,000 to, build that out. Well, in that case, to my mind, it's like, oh, well, really, they got to where they got on the last 500,000, and the first 1.5 is really ancient history. Doesn't really matter. It's a sunk cost. In terms of traction, it may speak to how the founders are, whether they're cash efficient in what they do. But really, in terms of traction, it's a reboot whenever you start doing whatever you're doing. So again, some nuances to point number 2. But let's go on to the third point. Okay, what type of revenue this is? The gold standard is annual recurring, like SaaS, software as a service. If you have people that are paying you every month or every year, and that automatically renews, and they have to actually tell you, please stop, that's the best. That's what people are looking for. People like me, investors, we love that. Now, not all businesses are built around SaaS. And I've seen some businesses say, oh, I've got to go to a SaaS model. And I tell them, no. You have to go for what makes the most sense to your customer. And if I, as an investor, don't feel the same way about that revenue, well, I'm secondary compared to your customers. So what are the kind of things we see, especially in the urban tech world? We see a fair number of startups that have hardware. They have to sell the hardware that unlocks a lot of the software services. In those cases, we may or may not discount the hardware sales to zero because that's just the cost of doing business. If you have good margins on it, the revenue helps you for cash flow, but we might not value that very highly. Now, some startups will then say, okay, we're not going to sell any hardware up front. We're going to rent it. So we just roll it into the annual or the monthly fee, and then it becomes SaaS, and then we're thrilled again. But that's not always possible. Sometimes there are one-time setup fees. Like, hey, this is a pure software platform, but we need to integrate with your systems. And those, that money is good for a cash flow, perspective, and it's good that it matches your costs with the cost of sales. But again, we usually discount that to zero because that's not a scalable part of your business. Now, where it gets a little bit more kind of gray is around transactional revenue. Like, okay, we don't charge per month, but every time a deal goes through, we get a percentage. or something similar. That's somewhere on the continuum between a one-time service fee, which I would kind of not count, and pure SaaS. When you're at a point where you have repeatable transactional revenue, and it's pretty standard, consistent from month to month, and you have a rough idea of people who do X will continue to do Y and Z over time, that gets pretty close, in my book anyway, to recurring revenue, to SaaS. When you're still early in your process and you get like, okay, we sold a house or we closed a deal and you get 3%, then you see nothing else from that client for a number of months, that's going to be more heavily discounted. Now, each investor has their own kind of way of thinking about it, but that's kind of what's going on in our mind behind that. And then last but not least, or actually least, are pure services revenue. Hey, we just do consulting on the side, or revenue from like a product that you're going to discontinue that's not core. I mean, great, money's money, but it doesn't tell me anything about your product market fit. It doesn't tell me about how big you're going to be. So that's kind of a zero as far as I'm concerned on the traction scale. Number 4, tell me about your customers, right? I'll give you a choice, right? If I have a startup, they're doing the same, I don't know, let's call it $200,000 of revenue, and they're doing it from 4 mid-sized companies, 50 grand a pop versus one big customer. I generally prefer 4 because it tells me a little bit more about their ability to sell repeatedly. And also it kind of protects me from, you have one big customer, but your uncle works there. And if he didn't do a pilot with you, it would be a very awkward Thanksgiving dinner. That doesn't really tell me about product market fit. So generally speaking, the more customers, the better, even if it's the same amount of revenue. Now, there's some caveats there. Like big name brand referenceable customers count for more than companies no one's ever heard of. So that gets a little bit squishy too. But at least that's how we think about it. Okay, moving on to the 5th, at least of what we're talking about here. There's definitely more, but the top 5 is how your go-to-market works. It really matters, right? So I want to know that the way you got those customers and that revenue is something that's repeatable and scalable. So a lot of times I get founders of companies like, and we got there all with no marketing spend, and that makes me really nervous, right? That means that you don't know how you're going to get your next 1,000 or 10,000 customers, right? You might have gotten that just through your network. You've worked at a bunch of companies. You went out on your own. You picked up the phone. Well, how do you get people that you don't know at all? I don't know. I haven't done that before. How are you going to do it if you have to do Google AdWords or Facebook ads? I don't know. We haven't tested that before. Like that gets me a little nervous. If a company comes to me and says, yeah, all our customers we got through this process, we put a couple $1,000 into Google AdWords. This is our cost per click. This is what it takes to get them to convert. These are the amount of people, how much money we got. And it's a 1 to 8 ratio between cost of customer acquisition and lifetime value, CAC to LTV. I like that because that tells me it's repeatable and scalable. So you might think, hey, I got there on 0 marketing spend. Sounds really cool, but it actually gets me really, really nervous. Okay, just a quick recap before a little bit about Dreamit in case you're wondering. As I mentioned, I run the Dreamit Urban Tech program. That's proptech, otherwise known as real estate tech and construction tech. We also have verticals in health and secure tech, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have about those if you'd like, or about the program in general. But this is mostly about you and your startups. So feel free to jump in with questions either about what I talked about in terms of traction, or even just about your startup in general, your revenue model, your customer base, your go-to-market, or anything else you have in mind. Sarah, what do we got?
We're working on it. Some are coming in now.
Cool. Anyone jump to the top of the list or not yet?
Not yet.
Okay, super. Let's talk a little bit about your revenue model in general. Like a lot of the companies that I see in urban tech fall into kind of the hardware plus SaaS bucket. And depending on how expensive your sensors are, one of the solutions is simply to roll it into the monthly fee. Now, there are actually companies out there who will help you finance that. So you might be in a situation where the sensor is not a trivial amount of money, or the install isn't. But if you're already a going concern, you can sometimes get these companies to finance you and then basically turned it into something more SaaS-ish. And that's, if you can do that, that's great. Sometimes people will just roll the one-time setup fee. They'll just eat that cost. You generally can't get people to finance your one-time setup, though. That's something you can't really do much with.
All right, we have a question from Devin, co-founder and CEO of, I hope I'm saying this right, Amiv, live immersive technology expert, data-free, occasional accordionist. His question is, you mentioned pivoting. What's the best way to communicate a pivot?
Okay, so people use that word pivot a lot, and they use it everything from minor course corrections to like just 180 degrees in a different direction. Just be upfront about it, and be upfront about the extent of how different it is. So if you have started out like, hey, we're just a VR tour provider, and you went general on it, and then later you found, we're not getting any traction in any of these other industries, but we're getting traction in real estate. So now we're going to do a VR tour. We're specifically going to build out features for real estate. I would communicate it as basically just that. It's not a full-on pivot. This was the technology we built. We found the segment that we really worked with, and now we're running with that and we're doubling down on it. If, on the other hand, you started off, hey, we're going to be B2C focused. Anyone can do it. We're going to show apartments on our own. And then you realize, what? None of that works. We have to go directly after the landlords or the brokers. Then you communicate as such, hey, we built a software platform. The business model didn't work, but we found that we could use it a different way, and we're testing out this new model. If it was like, hey, we were, dog walkers, and that didn't work out, so now we're going to go, help architects, virtually tour buildings under construction. Like, that's a totally new business. You just want to be totally clear, like, hey, the clock really started here. Nothing we did beforehand is at all relevant. The number one takeaway here is just be open and honest about it. If you're talking to an investor, we will find out ultimately what happened, and it's better if you can present it to us. But don't undersell. If there's stuff that you learned along the way, you developed along the way that is applicable to what you're doing now, you want to show it a little bit more as kind of a refinement and a continuation of what you did. And if it's really just a total like, that didn't work, let's try something new, just be open and honest about it.
All right, next question. This is a good one. If I'm pre-rev, how do I talk about traction?
Okay. Everything I talked about before was about revenue. So there are other traction points, and let's do that kind of in reverse order. So revenue is the best because anyone writing you a check means they really, really want what you got. So that's kind of the best proof of product market fit. Walking down the list a little bit, pilots that are fairly well advanced, even if they're unpaid, help. That gives me an investor someone to talk to and ask, how's it going? What worked? What didn't work? Are you going to convert? If this went away tomorrow, would you be like, no, I need this. Don't take it away. What can I pay you to keep it? So well-advanced pilots with meaningful customers who will give me like great feedback about what they want. That's the best. And then working down your list a little bit in terms of how advanced those pilots are. Pre-pilots, then you have to start talking about things like all the customers that you've spoken to, how their feedback has influenced the product. That way I have a sense that there may be product market fit out there. If you've had any early pilot discussions with them and you think some of them are going to be closed, like this is your pipeline. I normally say pipeline is hope. It's not a plan. So don't say, I've got all these companies in the pipeline. It doesn't really mean anything to me until you've closed it. In that circumstance, if that's all you've got, then being able to say, listen, I've been talking to Suffolk for the past 3 months. They want a pilot. We just need these 2 additional features. And then be prepared for me to say, great, who's your contact at Suffolk and can I talk to them? Right? If the answer is no, not really, then it's useless. Don't bring it up because I'm going to discount that to 0. I may even start to think like, these guys are shading the truth a little bit. If they meant it, they'd let me talk to it. But if you've got people who are really deal champions for you and who want a pilot that you can refer me to, you can reference that. Sometimes you can also reference things like awards or press mentions, or even if you're accepted into a meaningful accelerator program or a name brand VC, those could be kind of social proof that you can trumpet. But again, revenue is the best. Pilots that are close to revenue are second best. And then all those other things are, depending on where you are, the best you can do.
Cool. Next question. If I'm forecasting future traction, what are follow-up questions investors may ask?
So future traction is usually a code word for pipeline, but there are exceptions. So let's say you've got signed contracts that you haven't rolled out yet. So that's a signed deal. That's a real commitment. You're going to get a lot of credit for that in most cases. Now, as investors, we've all seen situations where we've had portfolio companies who've had signed deals and the implementation just keeps getting pushed off. So there's a little bit of a haircut you're going to get. And in some industries, that happens a lot. In other industries, it doesn't happen as much. So to take an example, Virtual Key is one of our portfolio companies. I'm not going to give away any non-public information. They have a lot of current revenue, but they also have a lot more signed but not yet deployed smart apartment solutions. So when we dug into that, like, well, why haven't they deployed yet? And they said, well, a lot of our customers are in the short stay market. July and August are very, very busy months for us. So none of them are going to deploy until after the busy season. Okay, that makes sense. I understand why they haven't deployed. I have a rough sense of what's holding it up and when they will deploy. And if I were considering an investment, one of the things I might do in a company like that is ask to speak to a few of the customers who have signed but not yet deployed. So I want to understand for myself if that's really the case. So if you're going to talk about signed contracts that haven't yet rolled out, be prepared to talk about why they haven't rolled out yet and even offer a reference or two. But I would count that in your projections. The next level down from that are what we call the land and expand people. So you're doing a 10,000. Here, another example. Just yesterday, I heard that one of our portfolio companies, a company named Stringbean, landed a just about $10,000 pilot in 2 buildings for a very large property manager in New York City. $10,000 isn't going to make them make or break the company at this point, but that same property manager runs dozens of other buildings. So they're at that early stage where that $10,000 of pilot revenue can ultimately become $200,000 of revenue once they're fully expanded. So if you want to talk about your land and expand process, that's great. And if you're far enough along that you can actually say, listen, we've done this for 6 or 7 companies already, and we start with a $10,000 pilot, and then in 6 months, they're like, great, we need to roll this out throughout this region, so then we end up being worth 50 or 60 grand, and then within 2 years, we're deployed portfolio wide, and that's $200 to $2 million. If you can show a couple of those scenarios have unfolded, then when you talk about your revenue projections, cynical SOBs like me, I'll actually give you a little bit more weight on it. Down at the bottom of the list is pipeline. Oh, I'm in advanced discussions with all these people. No, sure you are, right? I've heard that one before, and not to be too much of, sorry, what's the PG word for it? I don't know a PG word for it. Not to be too much of a dick. Sometimes it's legit, sometimes it isn't. But since there's so many of the times where founders are, so sure they're close and their partner's like, no, we had another 6 months of diligence here. I usually assume that pipeline is worthless until I've proven otherwise. But I'll give you a good counterexample. There was a company that went through our program early on, a company called City Zenith, very interesting company. And they were talking about their pipeline. And I said, listen, Michael, pipeline is hope. And he goes, yeah, but in my prior startup, which by the way he exited from, I sold 5 and 6-figure deals to every single one of the people on this list. And every single one of these people I've talked to at least 3 or 4 times, and they're just waiting for me to roll out features A or B before they sign a pilot deal. Okay, that's legit. These are people who sold to before, so when they say they're close, it's legit. They've written you checks before, so there's that kind of trusting relationship. And you've told me specifically what they're waiting for. And then presumably if I wanted to speak to 1 or 2 to confirm it, I'd be able to do it. So that's really that's the level of proof you need to have before I'm going to accept pipeline as anything other than, is it consistent with what you've done before? Okay, maybe plausible. But if you really want me to give it serious weight, it's got to be at that level. Otherwise, pipeline is hope.
Yeah, and just so before the next question, we got started a little late, everyone. So we'll stay on till around 12:45. So
Super.
Stick with us.
Sure. I have nowhere else I have to be.
Cool. Okay, next question. This is kind of a two-parter. How do I address an investor question like, what's your traction compared to competitors? And then a follow-up to that, when VCs ask why you win, what are they looking to hear?
Okay, so what's my traction compared to competitors? That's a tough one to ask because they don't tell you how much revenue they're making. So, your best and honest answer is like, hey, they haven't shown me their income statement or forecast, so I don't really know how much they're doing. You can talk a little bit in terms of how much they've raised as a rough proxy for how much money they may have made. So you could say, hey, I don't really know how much company X is making, but like us, they've raised a seed round, but not an A round. So I would assume we're roughly in the same space. You can also use that as an opportunity to talk through, like, I know that they charge X. I know that they go after this segment rather than the segment that we go after. So you can certainly use that as a departure point to show that you're familiar with the competition and you know why you're better, or for a particular segment or use case. Which brings me to the second one, like, why are you going to win? That's a catch-all for a lot of things, but the core element there in my book is, how are you better than that competition? So a couple of things that I hear sometimes that I don't have. Well, we've got a lot of industry experience. Okay. In real estate and construction and a lot of other B2B heavy industries, everyone who's credible has a lot of industry experience. Those are table stakes, right? Oh, we're going to work really hard. There are no slackers in this industry. If you are one of the world experts in a certain technology, and there are very, very other few people who are, yes, that's meaningful. I would cite that. If you have technology that no one else has, I would certainly cite that. If you have competitive advantage structurally over some of the other competitors, like they do A and B, they can't price the way we do because they would be cannibalizing themselves. They literally can't do this because they'd be shooting themselves in the foot. Those are the kind of things you can mention. You could also go down into feature level things that they haven't developed, presumably that are hard. But if you do go that route, it's not just a feature list, it has to be benefits. You have to say, we're the only one that have the ability to, what's a good feature level example from Smart Barrel? You want to talk through there, or do you want me to keep going? I'll keep going with it. So Smart Barrel has a check-in kiosk for people who are working on a construction site. And time cards, understanding like who's punched in and when, that's kind of a messy problem for a lot of subs and GCs. For him, he could say, hey, we're the only one that uses facial detection to make sure that the person who's signing in is actually that person. And everyone else just, they could buddy punch or use tags or what have you, and you'd have no idea who's who. So the feature is that facial detection. The benefit is I don't have to worry about buddy punching or fraud. So if you're going to go that route and you're going to talk about like feature by feature level advantages that other people don't have, definitely make sure you tie it back to the end customer's benefit. And last and certainly not least is when you're in a market where there are very strong network effects or marketplaces where getting there first and getting big fast makes it exponentially harder for anyone else to follow behind you. If you are first, say it. Like, hey, we're building a marketplace for X. As you know, marketplaces are super powerful. Once you have all the sellers, that's only where the buyers want to be. And once you have all the buyers, only the sellers only want to go there. And by the way, we are 3 times ahead in terms of size as any of our competitors. If you've got some story like that, definitely say it. So those are the things that go under the category of like, why are you going to win?
All right, this is a good one. You mentioned the slope of the line. What's more important, the absolute number or the slope? Absolute. Okay,
so the answer to the question is inherent in the question. It's not the magnitude of the data point, it's the slope of the line. So I'm going to play with your question a little bit, and what you might be saying is it, if I had a situation where I have one company that got to $1 million in annual recurring revenue in 6 years versus another company that's at $500,000 in 3, who do I love more? And that's kind of a tough judgment call, but all other things being equal, If it's taken you a long time to get where you are, my sense is it's going to take you an equally long time to double again, unless you can show me that that's not the case. Right? So let's say it took you a long time to get to that $1 million annual recurring revenue, but there's some kind of network effect there. And like, we're just at the tipping point where after we get to 10% of the market, all these other things unlock for us. Okay, prove it to me. It might be true. I might then say, okay, the slope of the line should start to increase. Or you might say, hey, it took us a while to get here, but we've just, the past 6 months, we figured out a new go-to-market. We haven't tried it before. This new go-to-market seems to be much, much faster. And let me show you my stats before and after. Right? If you're going to show me like your average sales cycle went from 12 months to 6 months, and your close rate went from 5% to 20%, over the past 6 months, then you can make a good case for the slope of the line in the past not being indicative of the slope of the line in the future. But all other things being equal, to me, it's the slope of the line. Now, a company that's a little earlier on, I might just try to match up that line against the longer company and see which one's steeper. I'll pull the clock back 3 years and take a look and see what's happening. But that doesn't always work, because sometimes the technology wasn't ready or the market wasn't ready. So there's no way you could have made faster progress. So that's a long-winded way of me saying it's a little bit squishy and a little bit of a judgment call. But usually the slope of the line tells me more than the absolute value.
More of a general question for the fall 2019 program. Are there any big themes you are looking for in startups for the urban sector?
That's a great question. So I'm a bit more of a tactical investor, right? So I see what's going out there and I try to decide, is the market ready for this? Is this the company I think is going to win? I don't go out there and lock myself in a room and think like, oh, something like this should happen. Let's go see if anyone's doing it yet. Now, that said, there's a bunch of technology that seems to be getting ready. So on the construction tech side, things like I'm going to go in there and do a LiDAR scan of the space during construction and make sure that before we pour concrete, that column is where it should be, because it gets a lot more expensive to fix that once I pour concrete. So those kind of tools are getting, at the point where there's widespread thirst for it, and adoption is beginning to take off. Slightly earlier, but also very interesting, are tools where people could basically teleport into a space and do remote tours. So for instance, I'm the architect, I'm back in my home office. A project manager has said, I have a question. I can't proceed until I have the answer. And then he's going to send me an RFI, a request for information. That slows everything down by a bunch of days. If instead I can just put on my HoloLens and I can walk through the room with him, and he's like, yeah, you see that duct over there? That has a potential to speed things up and reduce costs considerably. That technology will happen. Whether it's going to happen this year or 2 years, I don't know. And there are a number of other trends in the real estate space as well that I see be in various stages of ripeness.
Our next one is about faux traction. Is it a mistake to buy traction? We were thinking of juicing our traction by increasing our ad spend. Good or bad idea?
So the question is it really faking it, right? So what I want to understand is how you're going to grow your business. So if buying ads is going to be a part of your go-to-market, I'll give you a very, very simple e-commerce example. I'm going to take ads out on Facebook or on Google. People click. I know a certain percentage, it's going to cost me X dollars per click. I know a certain percentage of them are going to pogo stick back out. Then I know the people who stay on the site, a certain percentage of them are going to add an average value of, I don't know how many dollars into the cart. And at the end of the day, a certain percentage of those are actually going to consummate the sale. And I know what my margins are on those. So you can calculate that ROI. And if the ROI is good, you can just keep ramping up that spend until the price per keyword gets bid up so much that the ROI is not good, or until you run out of inventory. If that's your model, go ahead, buy as many ads as you want, because that tells me about what you're going to grow with. In fact, when I see companies like that, sometimes I'll ask them, so have you maxed out all your credit cards yet? Because if you really believe in that model, believe it's scalable, you should be doubling and tripling and quadrupling down. Now, if your model has nothing to do with it, and you're talking about acquiring customers in a way that would not be cost effective, or you would not go on an ongoing basis, or simply like you can only get so many customers that way and you're going to be tapped out soon, that doesn't really tell me as much about your business. So I will discount that. There are certain exceptions to that. You might have a business right now where you're doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes manually, but you can automate it. So a very interesting company that we talked to earlier today that lets you virtually furnish a residential space after asking the potential resident just a few questions about their taste. It's basically like having a robo interior decorator. You've seen two interesting companies in that space. Behind the scenes, before they can do that, they need to spend a few weeks manually ingesting the floor plans and mapping it out. In time, they can reduce that to almost fully automated. However, at this point, they can't. So they might get a customer and they might be willing to do that kind of work on their own, even though they're losing a little bit of money on that, because they know they can automate it later and they know the economics will work later. A similar example might be a hardware startup. Another company called Virtual App. They've got a robot that wanders through the space and can create a VR tour for people. They know that what that robot costs now. Actually, the economics do work now, but they also know that when they value engineer that and they're at scale, they can bring the cost of that robot down to about half. So if you're doing something that's not as scalable as otherwise would be because of cost that you're pretty certain to almost certain you can reduce later, that's fine. I'll ask you questions about it. You need to convince me that that's the case. But if you can, I'm like, great. I care about what your business is going to look like, how it scales. And if you're telling me that those costs will come in line, but what you really need to test is your ability to acquire the revenue, then great. That's what I care about the most.
Cool. Before our last question, just a reminder that you can still apply to our fall program, which starts in September at it's dreamit.com/apply.
Although technically deadline is passed. So if you're going to do that, shoot me an email. My email is andrew@dreamit.com. Just let me know and I'll do my best to get you into the review funnel, even though we're past the deadline.
All right. A question from Krista from Philly asks, who specializes in customer strategy, marketing, and communications. At what point should startups leverage marketing professionals to help drive traction? Is there a key marketing metric that enhances the traction story?
So, Krista, you're not going to like the answer. The answer is much later. Like, I'm betting on the team, so I want to make sure that the team can do it. Now, if they're bringing someone like you in there to help train them, and then they've acquired the skills, and then they're going to run with it, that's great. But if they're hiring somebody to get them sales, and then you're going to disappear, that's kind of a bait and switch for me, right? The moment you leave, where are those skills? Can they still acquire customers? Can they build out an entire team that can repeat that same process and get better at it? So I really need the skills to be in-house. So the short answer is, if you've got a team that doesn't have those skills and they're aware enough to know they need to bring somebody else in to teach them, that's good. If they're looking for a shortcut, to juice up sales, and we'll figure out who to hire later, that's a yellow flag for me.
Question from Roberto. I guess his company is a new era for zero carbon energy generation. Do you have any program that specializes in energy? So
no, energy tech is a subset of urban tech with a couple of caveats here. So we get a lot of startups that are in the smart world, this smart building, smart world, smart city space. And that's great. So they'll be energy based, they'll be transportation based. We'll even look at ag tech if it's urban and waste type and water type stuff. And we do have a couple of companies in there. The caveat is GovTech is hard. I mean, it is much, much harder than even enterprise sales to like large developers or property managers. And that's hard enough. So it's generally a much, much higher hurdle if you're selling stuff to the Department of Energy or the city's grid. If you're selling to private sector clients, even if you could sell to government or municipal clients later, as long as you can get to the next milestone by selling to developers, property managers, landlords, to a lesser extent, architects, brokers, and maybe even general contractors, then we're interested. We'll talk. And we can help you because those are the people in our customer network that we make introductions to during our customer sprint process. But if you're like, hey, we just sell to government, it's a really high bar for us. Now that said, we do have a bunch of companies that play in the space. And if you're not sure, you're welcome to go to the Dreamit.com website, go to the portfolio page, scroll down, click on Urban Tech, and then look through the companies that we've invested in. And you'll see, we'll see an urban wind turbine platform called Flower Turbines. You'll see an anti-leak startup called Lodic. So we do have bets in that smart city space, and you'll get a sense for whether or not like that fits for you.
All right, last question, and then we'll wrap it up. This is from Krishna, who's a software developer at the Montreal Neurological Institute.
Okay.
What are the most important factors to consider when taking on an investor at the seed level?
Ooh, okay. Most important factors in taking on an investor. Do they have money? Otherwise, it's a total fail. Can they add more than just money? So the ideal investor is someone who, A, they can write checks, and they can also introduce you to the kind of people that will make you more likely to succeed. So that could be additional clients. Like they might be strategic. They might have their own portfolio of buildings that they want to pilot your smart apartment solution in. Or they might be one of the key experts in the field, and you can get answers from them and things that would take you months of research otherwise. Or they might even be people with massive street cred. So like guys like Brick and Mortar, like if they're in your round, that gives you a lot of street cred. And I would have said the same thing, obviously, about Dreamit, but I'm trying to be a little modest here, which, you know, if Sarah's smirking in the background, it's because that's not easy for me. But yeah, if they can bring street cred or actual introductions, that's great. And then also just that fit. Like, especially at the seed stage, you're going to be in bed with these investors potentially for 10 plus years. And if they're going to be difficult, you know, life's short. You know, don't take that if you don't have to. And difficult could be a number of different flavors. It could be their first ever angel investment, in which case they have no idea that they're in for a 10-year journey. And they might ask you, like, when do I get my money back? I'm like, dude, it's been 6 months. It doesn't work that way. Or they may have a reputation in the space for not being great. So yeah, really get to know them, understand who they've invested in. Here's a good tip. Find out the companies they've invested in that are not doing well and ask them what it's like to have them on their cap table. Because investors sometimes will either go entirely dark if they've written an investment off, or sometimes they'll behave badly and interfere with the company's development if they think it's going off the tracks. So you really reach out to other companies they've invested in to get a sense for how they are, just as people and investors in general.
Cool.
Is that it for now?
I think we're good. Just a reminder, if there's future subjects that you guys would like us to talk about in the future, obviously, please ping us. You can email Andrew or I with any ideas you have. And secondly, for everyone that's on, we'll be doing the same exact thing with our health tech team tomorrow at noon. Mm-hmm.
And just so you know, we have very, very complicated email addresses, Andrew@Dreamit.com and Sarah@Dreamit.com.
Yep.
So it's been a pleasure talking to you all, and best of luck, and feel free to email us directly with any questions we didn't get to.
Thanks all.
Until then.
Ciao.